Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra and these are the key global headlines we are tracking this evening. On her first visit to India as the US Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen sends a message to China and Russia, calls for efforts to make supply chains resilient through friendshoring, meets Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and visits the Microsoft campus in Noida. Donald Trump and Republicans suffer a blow in the midterm elections. Democrats perform better than expected. Republicans set to retake the House, but with a slim majority. Ukrainian flags fly in Kherson after Russia claims it has completely retreated from the region, says it made the difficult decision to withdraw as Ukrainian troops continued to advance, but maintains the city is still part of Russia. Top executives continue to walk out of Twitter as Elon Musk hints at a potential bankruptcy 2 weeks after taking over the company. Fake Twitter accounts flock to get a blue check, creating chaos for several companies, brands and individuals. Decarbonization dominates discussions in the first week of COP27 Summit. US President Joe Biden addresses delegates on day 5. Occidental Petroleum CEO says tackling climate change is the responsibility of individuals, not just the oil and gas industry. It's been a hectic diplomatic week. Negotiations are on at COP27 in Egypt on climate financing and more ambitious targets on reducing fossil fuel consumption. The big warning for world leaders is this: global CO2 emissions are set to increase 1% in 2022 to a record 37.5 billion tons. From Egypt, world leaders, including President Joe Biden and new UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, would be heading to Bali for the G20. Among the expected highlights of the G20, a first in-person meeting between President Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Ahead of that crucial bilateral, Biden said that he would want to ask Xi Jinping about the red lines in the US-China relationship. Rising tensions due to the Ukraine-Russia war will be a big focus at the G20, and President Vladimir Putin has decided to skip the summit altogether. Instead, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov will be present in Bali. Ukrainian President Zelensky is set to participate, but virtually. Prime Minister Modi is also flying to Bali on the 14th of November and is likely to have bilateral meetings with key world leaders, including Rishi Sunak. On the last day, Indonesia will be handing over the G20 presidency to India. Let's now discuss the economic and political agenda at this year's G20 in Bali. Joining me now to take this forward is Stephanie Segal, Senior Fellow, Economics Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. Also joining us, Roman Kramarchuk, Head of Energy and Policy at S&P Global Commodity. Let me begin with you, Stephanie. Definitely, we're looking at a packed agenda for President Joe Biden. What will be his big pitch at the G20? We have been hearing that he would like to assert U.S. leadership over there.
Well, I think that's absolutely right. I think in making the trip to Bali, I think the key thing that he can bring is a message of engagement. I think it's important that he's there engaging, obviously, with G20 countries. You mentioned earlier in the broadcast the meeting that'll take place between President Biden and President Xi, demonstrating that fora such as the G20 are actually opportunities to put, as one advisor to Biden has said, put a floor on that relationship. And I think you need to put a floor on the tensions in order to make progress on some of the biggest challenges the world faces, and principal among them climate, which you also referenced. So I think it's also significant that he's headed there, just recently leaving COP27, and will have climate certainly on top of brain, as I think most leaders will.
Right. And we have the COP27 on in Egypt right now, and there will be a lot of takeaways from there which will be discussed at the G20 as well. Roman, you are joining us from Egypt right now. What is the mood? What is the big message emerging after week 1 of COP27? And what do you think will be the climate priorities at the G20?
I think it's been a very interesting week. I think there are things that we have never heard before spoken actively. Part of that is the idea of loss and damage, which is the idea that the countries that have been responsible for the climate problem until now should be willing to and able to compensate those that are feeling the impacts. That's one big thing. Another thing is that's going to be very relevant for the G20 is finance. Interesting that discussions about reforming the multilateral financial institutions have been on the table here. This is something that can carry over into the G20 as well. It's really the story, the interesting thread between COP and the G20. One of the themes of one of the three main pillars of the G20 is going to be sustainable energy transition. And that can't happen unless there are flows of money that actually can decarbonize the sectors where they are growing the fastest. And that really is in the developing world, that's in Africa, that's in South Asia.
Right. Stephanie, if I can come to you. Today, Janet Yellen was in Delhi and she made a pitch to India about friendshoring, about the need for friendly allies to come together to counter countries like Russia, which are weaponizing trade, weaponizing energy, and also stop over-reliance on China. Do you think that's a priority message that Biden will take to the G20 as well?
I think the message of resilience, which is my kind of understanding of how Secretary Yellen and how the whole friendshoring debate has been framed, is one that I think all countries coming out of the pandemic in the last few years, that message of resilience, including in supply chains, is one that resonates, not just here in the US, but I think globally. I would doubt very much that is going to be the priority for President Biden at the G20 or for Indonesia as this year's president. I think the focus there will be looking at how all G20 countries can actually contribute to solving some of the biggest challenges. And I don't think supply chain security will necessarily be a focus in G20 discussions, but certainly in the bilateral discussions.
Right. Roman, coming to you about the energy crisis that we are looking at right now, do you think the price cap on Russian oil that has been proposed by the European Union, by the United States, it has not been finalized so far, do you think there will be pressure to somehow come to an agreement on that at the G20 and also put more economic pressure on Russia?
I mean, if you look at who makes up the G20, there are countries like China, there are countries like India and South Africa that didn't even vote to condemn the Russian invasion in the UN votes. I think it's going to be nearly impossible for the G20 as a group, if they can't agree on such basic premises, to be taking strong steps on elements like the price cap. So the question is, what is it that we may see, and what can people agree? Well, what can the G20 agree on? It could be around dealing with the consequences of that energy crisis. So it could be around, for example, supporting the grain deal and looking to make sure that there is clarity on that. The other types of issues that could be agreed upon are, for example, around usage of nuclear weapons. These are the types of things that the G20 as an entire organization can probably agree on. From our perspective, the ability to agree on something as specific and as targeted as the price cap, when you have key members of the G20 that would not be actively supportive of that, is not something that we see coming out of this sort of agreement. So I think the interesting thing also is, yes.
Right. Stephanie, coming back to President Biden's economic agenda, what are his priorities going to be when he meets world leaders, according to you?
Well, I agree very much with Roman's point that the focus will be on issues and areas where there can be kind of common objectives and agreement. I think responding to the food and fuel crisis is certainly an area where there'll be focus. I think on the grain deal you'd mentioned, I think that's an area, in addition, looking at what some of the multilateral institutions have done in the very near term to respond to the crisis. The IMF has created a new facility specifically to respond to food price shocks. And you'd also mentioned kind of looking at what else the multilateral institutions can do and evolving those multilateral institutions. So I think those will be areas where there is kind of mutual interest among the participants there. One other issue that I expect Biden will push is on debt. This is an issue that has been covered in the past in the G20, but there's been a real lack of progress and an increase in the number of countries that are facing debt distress. So I think there will be an effort to see how the G20 can be used to move that debt issue and debt agenda forward. And it's going to be difficult, but I think the more countries that are in need of relief and assistance, the more energy there will be behind trying to find some solution on these debt overhang issues.
All right, I'll take final questions now with both our guests. Roman, beginning with you, India assumes the presidency of G20 from the 1st of December. What will be the expectation from India when it comes to taking the global economic agenda forward?
I can start with that coming off of, I think when we did a list of the 7 key things to look out for in this COP, what will India do and what will India's position be was among the top 7. India is in a very unique position, both geopolitically, but also in terms of the energy transition, in terms of coal use, in terms of the ability to drive renewables and interest in renewables. I think their position here is going to carry over. It's the point I made earlier that actually finances and the access to finance, the access to developed world contributions to resilience, mitigation, and adaptation, all these things are going to be carried through very specifically at COP, but they're going to be addressed in the G20. And when India is going to have that opportunity, it's certainly there's going to be an energy transition and energy resilience element to things that are going to be critical. I think, you mentioned supply chains earlier, then this is kind of where we see a bit of a fragmentation, but the U.S.'s big Inflation Reduction Act in some ways is reshaping how these relationships will play out. And I think India will have to also deal with the fact that the U.S. will be looking to create that friendshoring. It will be less of a fully multilateral organization because the U.S. is seeking to create those specific supply chains and do industrial policy that way. So I think India has the opportunity to clearly lead on things like energy transition and investment, but they also will face challenges with the U.S.'s Inflation Reduction Act.
Right. Stephanie, one quick question to you. If you had to define one key opportunity for India to make a difference to the global economy during its G20 presidency, what would that be?
Well, I think the prioritization of climate, as we've been discussing, and that consists kind of 2 big pieces, one on the national commitment side and specific and concrete plans for emissions reductions using the G20 to ensure that all G20 countries are in fact making those plans and that they're ambitious. And then the second piece, which Roman also mentioned, is how do we actually get there? And that requires mobilizing trillions of dollars in finance. So Indian leadership on how you do that, both working through the multilateral institutions and mobilizing private capital. I think those are going to be areas that India can work on this year and will be essential for G20 years to come.
All right. Thank you very much, Stephanie and Roman, for joining us, putting the G20 in Bali in perspective for our viewers. We're going to take a short break, but when we return, we take a deep dive into the U.S. midterm polls and how they will impact President Joe Biden's presidency. A special discussion with the former Indian ambassador to the United States, Arun Singh, when we're back. Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. The midterm elections in the United States are being watched closely. They are, in a way, a referendum on the incumbent president's performance. This time, Democrats have performed better than expected, and Republicans are likely to take control of the House of Representatives with a thin majority. This could still lead to a showdown between Republicans and Democrats on key policy matters. This election also has a bearing on who could be running for 2024 presidential elections. Biden has said he intends to run for re-election. Donald Trump has also hinted at a potential candidature for 2024. We're now joined by Arun Singh, former Indian ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Singh, thank you for joining us. The Democrats have performed better than expected. Will there be greater scrutiny of Joe Biden's policy agenda in the remaining part of his term still?
There's bound to be greater scrutiny because according to the present trends, although final results are still awaited, although the Republicans have done not as well as was predicted earlier or as had come out from the polling data, they are still likely to get the majority in the House of Representatives. Although in the Senate, it seems that the Democrat may be able to keep their majority. So if the Republicans get the majority in the House of Representatives, they will try and stall the president's legislative agenda. Even when the Democrats were in the majority, and some very important legislation was passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, to support semiconductor manufacturing in the US, the infrastructure bill. The Republicans, by and large, did not vote for those measures. Not because they didn't think it was useful, but in the deeply polarized US politics. And when President Trump had continued to dominate the Republican Party, they didn't want to be seen to be associated in any way with the Democratic Party or the agenda that President Biden was bringing to the legislation. So given that, if they get the majority, what is more likely is that they will try and show that President Biden is not being effective in the legislative process. They will try and stall the administration by holding hearings, by doing investigation. There is even talk of doing a pro forma impeachment. So all that will happen. But I think the Democrats also have an opportunity because as a result of these elections, if they don't have the majority, the progressive wing of the Democratic Party will be seen as somewhat weakened in terms of the demands it can bring for legislation. So it may give more of an opportunity for moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats to work together. If that happens, I think that might help the president.
All right. So who could be the Republican candidate, Ambassador Singh, for 2024 now?
So far, President Trump had continued to dominate the Republican Party. Many people who had taken steps against him, supported either his impeachment or had criticized him, opted out of the race or lost in the elections, in the primaries that were held earlier for the Republican Party. So it was expected that Trump may emerge as the unchallenged Republican candidate for the president in 2024. And there was an indication that he may make an announcement as early as November 15. But that now has been pushed, it seems, to next year, partly for legal reasons, but also because the Trump-endorsed candidates did not do very well in the main elections that took place on November 8. So I think there is a sense now that the electorate is moving away from some of the postures, the antics that President Trump had adopted, and the more moderate Republicans are stepping up and have managed to get some support. The Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who many would not really categorized as a moderate Republican, but he has taken an anti-Trump position. He did very well. The former Vice President Mike Pence, his book is likely to be released in November, this month itself. Some extracts have come out, and he's tried to show himself as a person of character, somebody who stood up to President Trump on January 6th. So I think challenges will now appear to President Trump in the Republican primaries for the Republican nominee.
And I would also like to ask you about the rise of Indian Americans in US politics. We have seen a number of them winning the state contests.
So it's a trend that has been evolving. You know, the earlier generation that went from India largely focused on stabilizing themselves, focused on creating economic opportunity. But I would say for the last 10, 15 years or more, they have become more active in US politics as they integrate more in US society. And I was assigned to the US during the days also of the Obama presidency. And I could see at that time more and more Indian Americans becoming key personnel in the administration, staffers on the Hill. Till 2013, for example, historically, we had a total of 3 Indian Americans who had ever served in US Congress. And from that time, we've continuously had 5 Indian Americans in US Congress being re-elected through various cycles. At this time, the number is going to go up to 6. So 1 more person has entered the US Congress. And at the local level also, more and more people are contesting the elections. And you'd have seen that 1 Indian American candidate has just been elected the Lieutenant Governor of Maryland State. So they are certainly taking key positions. But then, if you look at the economy and technology sector, many of the CEOs of leading US companies are persons of Indian origin. So I think there is now more and more integration of Indian Americans in US society, in economy, in the technology sector, and also in politics.
And my final question, Ambassador Singh, next week the Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, he will be heading to the G20 Summit in Bali. There could be a possible meeting with President Joe Biden. What do you think will be the focus of discussions from the Indian side?
One is to keep taking the bilateral relationship forward in different areas. You may have seen that when President Biden and Prime Minister Modi had met in May in Tokyo on the margins of the Quad Summit then, they had issued a joint statement, a bilateral joint statement also, where there was a specific provision for the two setting up a structure between their national security councils to start a process of cooperation on critical and emerging technologies. And that's something that will create new areas of cooperation, artificial intelligence, quantum, 6G, cyber, space, semiconductors. So that will certainly be one area. And I'm sure they would want to talk about what's happening in the global situation. There's so much flux in terms of great power competition between US and China, US and Russia. On Russia, India has some differences from the US position. On China, there's a convergence in terms of India also having adversarial aspects in its relationship with China. And of course, they would also look at the global economic situation because G20, as you know, focuses largely on the economy, the financial situation. And global economy, according to what most people say, is headed towards a recession in 2023. So what does that mean? How do you deal with it? How do you build partnerships? People are now talking of more and more building secure supply chains, friend-shoring of production. So in reordered supply chain that is being worked upon, what is the kind of partnership India and US will build? So I think these would be important areas to discuss.
All right, Ambassador Singh, thank you very much for joining us. Putting the US midterm elections in perspective for our viewers. Yes, they will have a lot of impact for US foreign policy, for President's legislative agenda, but little impact on the India-US partnership. There is bipartisan consensus, and this relationship will only grow stronger. Ambassador Singh, thanks once again for being with us on CNBC TV18. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. But don't go anywhere. News continues on CNBC TV18.